Hi, I'm Stefan Candea from the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism and also the coordinator of a new established network called the European Investigative Collaborations. And I will just shortly introduce everybody who's going to be on the panel. We'll have a presentation from Mark Hunter, and then Johnny West and Heiner Ulrich will join on a podium discussion around mainly how investigative journalism is using or plans to use or try to use annotations. So first, Mark Lee Hunter, he's the co-founding member of the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and he is working at INSEAD, writing about co-founder of the Stakeholder Media Project. Mark, if I
think. Here we go. Okay. Well, first, look, I'm really honored to be talking to a group of people who are as expert at what they do as you are. I'm going to try and tell you about my area of expertise, which is studying some changes that are happening in the media industry. Now, I come at this from the standpoint of an investigative reporter, and the last decade has not been especially kind to mainstream news media, MSM. Okay, these are the figures of the Pew Research Center in the United States. I could show you comparable figures for the UK and France and any other place where I might be able to speak the language. But what we see is that from 2002 until 2012, there was a huge dive in credibility. This is going to come back to annotation because I'm going to discuss annotation in the context of credibility and in the context of an alternative that's emerging to the mainstream news media. Okay, what you need to see from these figures is that there was, a big drop in the credibility of news organizations. Now this is quite serious because it gets to the core of their value proposition. The reason you buy news media is to get information you can use to make decisions that affect your own life and the influence you may have on your society. If you don't believe what's in them, why would you buy them? A second point that leads into this is that the news industry has radically downsized its capacity. I happen to teach in journalism schools as well as work at INSEAD, and I've seen this ripple effect go across the sector. It's getting harder to recruit talent to be journalists because there are fewer jobs. In fact, the number of jobs since the beginning of the 20th century in the US industry went down 30%. This is not a small cut, folks. A lot of people went to other places. Some of them went into PR. Some of them founded nonprofit investigative centers, as Stefan Candea did in Romania. And this also had an impact on the quality and depth of stuff. There were fewer people covering. Whoops, what happened there? Why? Well, I'll just tell you the story. Oh, good. So there were fewer people covering fewer subjects. Now, people still need information to function. They can't get along if they don't know what's going on. So what took their place? Well, around 1995, I was covering different aspects of French society. I've been there for 34 years now, and I started to see the emergence of media that were founded by stakeholder groups in that society. We're going to use Freeman's definition of a stakeholder. Okay, Freeman is the guy who invented this field. And a stakeholder is someone who affects or is affected by a larger organization. It can be a government, can be a company, can be the local mayor's office, whatever. These people began creating their own media in massive numbers, visibly massive numbers, in the 1990s when Netscape revolutionized the access of the internet, and suddenly people realized they had a new environment available to them. One of those people was the French National Front. You may have heard of them. They're Jean-Marie Le Pen's party. That's his daughter, Marine, who's now taken over the party. It's now the biggest party in France. When I worked with them, around them, as a reporter in the 1990s, they were the only French party that had their own website. They also had created a parallel media network for the very simple reason that they were shut out of the mainstream media. Greenpeace was doing the same thing about this time. That's a photo of the Brent Spar occupation in the North Sea. That year, in their annual report, Greenpeace said, we're becoming a media organization. They now have become an investigative journalism organization. It's one of the 3 pillars. So you can guess the success they had by realizing that they could go around the mainstream media to create their own content. This one was founded by a former French member of Reporters Beyond Borders, a guy named Pierre Chirac. They're the leading investigative media concerning the pharmaceuticals industry in France. They put people in jail. They're astonishing. They far outperform the mainstream media. And this is lawnsite.com. I found out about these guys because one day there was a headline in the New York Times about an herbicide that went south, okay? And I Googled the herbicide and ended up on lawnsite.com, which is a user forum of lawn care operators. Has anyone here ever been or known a lawn care operator? Well, they're the people who keep green spaces looking nice. These guys bought this herbicide and it started killing trees. Within 2 weeks, they had created a nationwide news network based in a professional forum. They had recruited university research centers. They were in touch with regulators. They ran rings around DuPont. They created a national movement and a national center of expertise based in a user forum. If you see a parallel there to what happens with annotation, that's the one I'm thinking of. Okay, user forums are where people share information and comment on what they're seeing. They created that kind of movement, and the result of that movement was the destruction of the professional products division of DuPont, which is hardly a passive or simple target. That division was sold off to a competitor for a pittance on top of over $1 billion in damages that were driven by a group of people who can't spell right. Okay. This is what's underlying all of these phenomena, okay? We're looking at a shift in the way people make, consume, and distribute news. It's a shift in the business model. Okay, now, I'm not necessarily happy with all of this, okay? My career began right after Watergate. I'm an old school guy in certain ways, but I do see certain things happening here that are not gonna go away and that I think are very, very powerful, and some of them I like quite a bit. We'll talk about the stuff I don't like in a moment. Okay, 4 minutes. Thanks very much, Stefan. First of all, the mainstream media model is heterogeneous. That's the business model. You want the biggest audience you can have. BuzzFeed still works that way. Okay. The stakeholder-driven media are aimed at a community of practice or interest. They're people who know what's going on. Now, some mainstream media are treating their public this way. The best example is The Correspondent, which is in the Netherlands, which is creating continuous interchange with its public. Most people are having a hard time with that. Heinrich will tell you a little bit about that. The ethics have nothing to do with being objective and neutral. They have to do with being transparent. This is what we want. This is what we stand for. You don't go to Greenpeace to find out that the environment matters and what X, Y, and Z think about it. You go there because you know the environment matters and you want somebody to tell you what to do about it. That brings us down to the bottom of the page. We're moving from what matters to what we're going to do about it. And the next one, the time factor, is hugely important to me as an investigator. I look at the past to see what the present and the future are going to become. This is the same thing that's happening in stakeholder-driven media. We did one study about BP where we found that an incident that had occurred 5 years before had been completely forgotten in mainstream media, but was present on 37,000 websites. You know, we're looking at parallel worlds here. There are 2 things these people want to do. The first is protest and pressure. Okay, information is power. I'm going to show you how the power works on the next slide, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues. But there are feedback loops that occur between these stakeholder-driven media because they're talking about real interests. So if they get the information that can drive action, they get very powerful. The second thing is we've seen them save companies as well as destroy them because they can bring other people into a virtuous circle of support. You know, I'll talk about this with anybody who's interested later, but I want you to understand this is not just a negative phenomenon. These people are extremely creative. They're the concretization of what Eric von Hippel has found with user innovation, among other things. This is what it looks like from a system dynamics perspective. I'm sorry about this. My dear colleague, Maria Beziou, who's working in Hamburg at Kuhn, is a system dynamics expert. And one day we said, what do the system dynamics look like? System dynamics is the study of knock-on effects and feedback loops. We took 3 cases of corporate crises where we knew all the players in detail, and we mapped them looking for common elements. You don't have to become an expert in system dynamics to realize what's going on here. Somebody makes a move, somebody responds to it. They knock into somebody else. It comes back, and it keeps going back. And the cumulative momentum and force is very impressive. Every one of the cases we based this on were cases in which a much larger organization was defeated by objectively small, relatively powerless groups driving these things. It took years, okay? It's not the kind of thing you see with the Panama Papers where, you know, the head of Iceland resigns the week that the news comes out. These things take years, but in the end, the overall force is astonishing. And I want to say that force is based on the control of valid information of the kind we can see coming through annotation, okay? We're going to be seeing a lot of need for annotation because there's a dark side to this movement. You know, the Russian use of propaganda is absolutely pioneering in this regard. They are creating false flag systems as Exxon did in the 1990s. But there are also people coming up who are going for a fact-based approach and who are building their communities around continuous input of information. Okay, thank you very much. By the way, later on, give me your card if you want to see a forthcoming free book, which we are distributing about the business models for these kinds of media. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. You should stay on the podium. So we'll move to a sort of discussion. Feel free to ask questions. We'll have a short introduction and description of what we do. I will be sort of in between Heiner, who works for a big media, Spiegel, as part of the IT department, leading the IT department, but with a history in the research department where they do fact-checking. And Johnny West, who is the founder of Open Oil, and maybe he fits the description of stakeholder-driven media. And because I'm introducing them, I will start with the presentation. I'm Stefan Candea, as I said, working for the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism, and we are a group of journalists who left the traditional media 15, 16 years ago and started a small group doing investigative stories. We thought we would only do investigative stories and then push our stories to the media landscape that we knew. Actually, we ended up dealing with all this kind of stuff, like platform, building up a platform to amplify what we do, building up an audience, or seeing which direction we should go to have an audience, because nobody was looking at our website. The right tools to process information, to exchange information, and so on. So we have like 15 years of different trials and errors and behind us. What I was starting to use annotations for, I found them really interesting in the process of the pre-publication process of the investigative, of an investigative project, where you could annotate. We work in Europe, so we work with different languages. For instance, you can annotate a document, a joint document in a group. Some of that process of annotations can be even published, and we try to integrate that with a recent story we did in this network with Spiegel and other media on the black market of weapons in Europe. We were looking at several documents, policy documents, regulator documents, national documents or European documents, and we were flagging the relevant passage or relevant information. Some of that was pushed on our website in English called the blacksea.eu. It is hard to, we really have to play with this process because we face, as investigative journalists, we face one particularly hard issue on the security and the secrecy of this process before publication. Sometimes we deal with collection of documents that shouldn't be public because the source choose not to make them public, but to work on them. So although this process is really helpful, we have to deal with the technology related to where the annotations stay, what links do the annotations show to what repository of documents, and we have to think about different threat scenarios before publishing, mainly to protect the source and to protect the scoop, let's say. But that's the thinking of more traditional media journalists who thinks in terms of scoop. We also see a value in using it after publication instead of relying on the old comments section or the mails coming in and tipping on a possible follow-up, to open the space of annotation for other people to add content to our stories. And because I was talking about our issue being a small investigative group with not having an amplifier for our stories, we usually worked in partnership with other existing media. So we were not relying on our own website to be the amplifier for our story, but to be merely an archive of stories and information. I think we are playing with it with annotations. We are playing with hypothesis annotations to post a linkage between the stories we published in the past to different other websites where you find information in databases or where you find information in other articles. So that was, in short, tour on how we use this. Let me go to Heiner, who works at Spiegel. He will tell a bit about his work. And Heiner wanted to speak about this concept of annotation in the framework of their own internal shift from print to digital when it comes to the process of fact-checking, and also their own internal problems when dealing with the individual author or the group of authors that produce a ready-to-publish product towards this new model where you publish for a community that also adds information to your product.
Thank you, Stefan. As Stefan mentioned, I'm working in the IT department. I'm responsible for editorial processes and editorial workflows at the Spiegel. I'm doing this for many years now. Annotation and classification and ordering of content is, of course, a basis of journalistic work, of editorial processes since I know them, since the 90s. I was leading a development of bringing the paper archive at the Spiegel to the digital world, to create a digital archive, and the archiving platform, the technical platform, the tools we developed were drivers of constant change in the editorial process. So, and I see it today. I still see it today that if we talk about annotation, if we talk about how journalists interact with users, how users, readers interact with journalists in a more, just do it more than in the past, at least at Spiegel and other traditional media houses, then I would always start with the point of view, how can I develop the editorial processes, our in-house processes, in a way that they support this kind of interaction, that they support new business models, as was pointed out. And try to build on top of our strengths. And our strengths are fact-checking. Our strengths are the research. We have a whole department which is not many media houses have something like this. We have this research and fact-checking department we call Dokumentation. These are research journalists who are working there, and you might not know that, but every article printed in the Spiegel is researched, at least also by research journalists, and of course it's fact-checked. Every fact is checked. So,
how big is the department?
The department is, thank you, Stefan. It's around 100 people working in the fact-checking department of the Spiegel. So. We always, since many years, we were thinking how we could make the product better, how we could make the presentation of the journalistic product, maybe on paper or maybe digitally, how we can make it better by combining the article with other facts which have been researched during the writing process of the article, with hyperlinks to facts, so that the reader can go deeper if he wants to. In the end, we tried a few things, and in 2011, I believe, we even created a new product called Spiegel Wissen, Spiegel Knowledge. It was a product built on top of Wikipedia, a Bertelsmann lexicon, and of course the Spiegel content of Spiegel Group, edited by journalists. We created topic pages, like maybe you know them from Guardian, New York Times. Everybody did that, but we did it very early, and in the end, it was no success. So. The idea of developing this internal process of fact-checking and of course annotation, which takes place internally at the Spiegel, not really. Yeah, we didn't really pursue that much. So maybe that's all.
May I comment on that or annotate that?
Okay, but brief, because we wanted to go to Johnny.
I just want to say it's very interesting because, I mean, it indicates that the process is more radical than we would have thought, okay? Because it does involve a challenge to an existing business model within a media house, but there are startups now like The Correspondent in Amsterdam, which has integrated a form of annotation into their editorial processes very publicly, and it's one of the reasons they're a success. So, you know, different things can work in different contexts.
Yeah, I didn't, and I think we should keep on trying, because, of course, this is the direction we should go, and we must go. We have to use our strengths to have a better communication, to have more communication with the reader, and to enable the communication from the reader back to us, back to the journalists, of course.
Thank you. Thanks, Heiner. So, as Stefan said, I'm Johnny West. I'm run a publishing house based here in Berlin called Open Oil. And I guess we fit into Mark's definition of SDM. Important to get that middle initial right, otherwise we could end up in entirely different territory. We are niche, essentially niche publishers, but as Mark has indicated, we hadn't necessarily consciously articulated the idea that we build a community, but that is in fact what has happened, and that community comes in to help create information and knowledge processes and products, as well as consume, which is where I guess we began. So on our relationship to commentaries and annotations, I think I want to make 3 points. I mean, the first is we employ a principle which we call all power to the source. The second is the importance of interpretation for our work, and then how you make that interpretation credible. And the third is that all of this stuff is quite hard in terms of dealing with existing expectations, but quite doable in our view. So what we do is super geeky and technical, and we are stakeholder driven in the sense that we do what we do for a very particular reason. We have a very particular agenda, but in fact we position as a company, and all of our products and deliverables look entirely technical and neutral. The processes and products we choose to develop and the sequence we choose to develop them in are where our agenda is, but our product, it's very important for our products to be unchallenged by the existing consensus because they are technically robust, and they are. So the question of usability of material by integrating source, which of course is what annotation offers. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting with an official from the Zambian Ministry of Finance, and we were going through a search engine we've put together which scrapes all of the corporate filings released in major financial jurisdictions anywhere in the world. For filings of companies present in Zambia. He's responsible for taxation of big mining companies in Zambia. The first document we casually dropped into, and this is a system where we've scraped it, but we leave all the original links to the original sources, happened to show that the biggest single mining company present in Zambia may be about to go bust. We ran a search on the terms doubt, going, and concern, which is auditor language for could be about to go bust. And it turned up in a 3-week-old filing on the Canadian exchange. Now here's the importance of source. This official already knew of the case, but he said to me quite explicitly that he wanted to raise it with his minister, but didn't feel he could because he'd read it on a mining website. But the fact he then had access to the source document was the difference for him between being able to spend some of his political capital, because presumably this is controversial, by going into a minister and saying, here is the filing which shows we could be in big trouble, as opposed to potentially being exposed by randomly quoting a website. The direct access to source is phenomenally important for a bunch of serious work processes. That's the first thing. Interpretation, we do a lot of analysis of contracts, and we build financial models based on public domain information. Now here you're dealing with a question not so much of can you show original source, but there's a second level of have you understood the original source correctly? And we may choose to summarize a complex contract and the way it implements fiscal terms, modes of taxation on a company, in things which end up as single cells in a spreadsheet. But when we provide a link to exactly that section of that clause of the contract, we allow the user to go directly and reach their own assessment of whether we have correctly interpreted. Now, of course, like any other referencing material, the fact is that only 2% of such users will do that. But it's not to underestimate the genuine reassurance effect to all 100% of users, the knowledge that they can do that if they wish. So that question of interpretation of complex material is something for which annotation is essential. Why is it so hard to change attitudes? We compete essentially with a lot of closed source providers who charge thousands and tens of thousands of dollars a year for subscription. And when you talk to users of those services, the only source ever quoted in Wood Mackenzie is Wood Mackenzie. That doesn't mean, by the way, it's bad. There's lots of... The point is that there are no grown-ups. data is lacking everywhere. What they very excellently do is to interpolate and to guess and to make assumptions where they need to based on strong domain knowledge. That's not the problem. The problem is you as the user never know which is which. When you look at a bunch of capital expenditure estimates of a bunch of oil fields, which one was an actual data point, which one was an informed guess, which one was an interpolation between two other data points, you don't know because the only brand provided is Wood Mackenzie. And then it's a too big to fail question because someone pays $50,000, it must be right. So there's a certain inertia there in those attitudes. But it's all possible. My time is up.
Sorry, but we can go on. I thought we have less than 10 minutes for questions. If anybody wants to ask some direct questions. And just to, I forgot to add, on the technical aspects of how we are using our search tool and integrated with hypothesis annotation, there will be a presentation of Alex Morega, who's here. It's going to be tomorrow during the Flash Talks at 3. So, you have a question? I have the mic. Anybody a question?
What would you say are the biggest technical, or from a user's point of view, what are the biggest technical problems you have with the current tools you use?
It's a question for who? A question for who?
With the what?
For the panel generally, or anyone on the panel who wanted to answer.
So you are asking about the usability problem?
No, I was asking from a what are the biggest difficulties you have with the tools you use at the moment?
The annotation tools, you mean?
Annotation tools, or just tools that you use for managing the information whilst you're doing investigative journalism?
I think the usability and the process to set up these tools and the highly dependence on security issues for me. Maybe you want to...
Yeah. Okay. There are different approaches to this, okay? We talk about this in the Global Investigative Journalism Network all the time. One of the big issues is internal cooperation among people who are working across borders, like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists who just released the Panama Papers. I mean, people are developing their own tools and systems based on open source in order to enable them to collaborate. They're mostly using internal forums. Okay, now it's clear to me after what I've heard this morning that annotation is going to be playing a big role here, okay, because the step change in speed and in accuracy is just so big. People are going to start integrating those tools. But for the moment, the big problem is teaching people who don't collaborate how to collaborate, and the tool that's been used is forums more than anything else.
If I can just pick up on that. So I absolutely agree with Mark, and by the way, I come from the same background. I started life as a Reuters journalist. So, but then, in fact, the technical issues are really only an expression of the underlying social engineering problem. That many, not all, but many investigative journalists are kind of natural loners. But they understand at an intellectual level the need to work in teams and so on, but it's hard to make that stick, exactly. So those technical glitches are really only reflections of social engineering issues, in my view.
Yep. Is this working? Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree more. Than the people like us who are thinking about concepts of enabling journalists working together, concepts of annotations, concepts of tagging and so on, are usually right now confronted with journalists who just don't use these, have never used tools like this, have never thought in this direction, and are good journalists, are great journalists, and do a great work, but are really at the beginning of collaboration in this international context. So the problem right now is really onboarding. Yeah. Make it easy.
There's one other thing, okay, which is that these tools offer a huge competitive advantage for anyone who can use them to lock in the most influential and informed readers they have. That's what The Correspondent is doing in the Netherlands. I mean, if you're interested in this, you really have to look at what they're doing. They have a passage in English where they talk about it, and we talk to them, you know, at the Stakeholder Media Project. They're some of the first to understand that, you know, you're fighting to hold the loyalty of people, to get them involved in the news process so they won't go someplace else. And annotation is one way to do that. And people are looking at that in different forms now. But, you know, the forms right now are proprietary. My guess is this is about to go open source in a very big way, especially after what I hear in this forum here.
So, going one step further, what about the security and privacy issues related to annotation? Because, you know, the Panama Papers was what, 1 year was done behind the closed doors? I mean, 2 years. So the issue of privacy and security is enormous, and, you know, your use case in this sense is probably one of the toughest ones.
I think this is a very broad question because I think it goes down to the impression of security for the users. That, you know, depends on the threat model, depends a lot of who wants to get into your system, and depends on the data you are working with. It's a government, it's a company, it's organized crime, it's a group of hackers who really want to expose you as incompetent technically. So I think it's a question that has so many different answers in terms of different user scenarios. What I find, what we would like to do is to have the annotations living, the annotations themselves at the pre-publication process, living on our own server, so that we have a container with the annotations as a text, but also with the links we are exchanging to each other. But if the URL, if the working server is really secure, then you don't have to fear so much on the link that you are exchanging, but you have to sort of protect your annotations. But the paradigm, I mean, the idea of the whole process is to find a way to transfer that from the pre-publication to the post-publication process. So you give access to the documents with the annotations, right? So that's what we are facing now. And I also think the feed of annotations, for us, it's useful in a group, if you annotate in a group different stuff, because you can follow on the feed directly. It can be a sort of message stream environment for the documents themselves. That's also a different thinking than putting one social network interface and one database interface, searchable database interface. They don't really join together, you know, and you lose a lot of the information exchange. That's my view.
Were you talking or asking about the wider context of, you know, privacy considerations in terms of publications of the documents themselves?
No, of your own annotation. I mean, of your own annotation. I mean, there may be countries where my anonymity is very important when I make annotations.
We have to realize that, okay, we can't take the extreme use case as the typical case. Okay, the Panama Papers and things like that are very, very important stories, but they're not the only stories. And there are a lot of issues that play out over much longer periods of time and that involve the formation of coalitions. You know, the movement against genetically modified organisms was done completely through stakeholder-driven media. They came up through stuff like, you know, coffee talks, okay, and you know the same thing applied to the movement to make people aware of climate change. These took place outside the mainstream media through a constant process of dialogue and shaping, and now we're looking at the automation of certain aspects of this. Now, these aren't high security type operations. Of course, you can have oil companies looking over your shoulder. That's not always comfortable, but you can do these processes in a much more public way, and the long-term impact can be absolutely immense.
I think related to the first question, how do we deal with adjudicating who has authority to do fact checking and things of that nature?
I didn't get you the full question, I believe.
So, as a media organization, if you are, let's say, you want to take your internal process and make it external, as you say, the correspondent has been trying to engage users in this kind of thing, where if you have an expert in a certain field who enjoys commenting on your platform, how do you make sure that they're actually an expert and not some crazy guy who is obsessed with this and has a biased viewpoint? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. In our case, it's a little bit different. Maybe my colleague could answer for the correspondent later. In our case, it's our specialists are working in-house in the fact-checking department. So we have many researchers there who could provide insights, but still there is the huge problem that they could not reveal all their sources. So in most cases they could and they would reveal sources, but in many not. The other thing is how to react on, well, yeah, I think it's a problem all over communities, how to establish the credibility of a source.
I think there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, one is the question of community knowledge management. It's 2016 and we don't need to think about these things as though they are problems that nobody's solved yet. Some online communities have been going for 25 or 30 years around highly technical subjects. And there's a bunch of techniques out there. Do you want pre or post moderation? Do you want some combination of points allocated by? These are all very, very standard features. Mainstream media may be still largely isolated from them, but it doesn't mean that these are somehow processes that have to be invented. They've been around since the 90s, is the first thing. Second thing, just, a personal observation is crazy viewpoints, I think, are often underrated. There's a lot to be said for crazy viewpoints. We suffer just as much from conventional wisdom staying incumbent far too long as from, crazy viewpoints, which I would distinguish from trolling in any aspect.
One other thing is that, I'm sure you've spent a lot of time on internet forums and you've noticed the self-policing function that happens. Okay, when you're speaking within communities, people often know each other very, very well. Okay, and they build their reputations and their expertise over a long time, and that has something to do with it. And part of the competition among media for audience is going to be getting those people on board. So I see annotation as a competitive device for competitive advantage as well.
Just to add on that, in my experience, I think exactly this kind of question is kind of blocking the access of the relevant people to working groups, and it's the design of the communication system where you have one person, centralized person who has the authority to bring people in, kick people out, or vet them. This kind of thinking of the fear of the trolls or whatever is kind of blocking the community to grow around relevant sources or experts or expertise. Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks. Sorry? He showed me timeout, so but we will be here. Thanks a lot for having us.